The damp earth of Cedar Falls Cemetery still carried the scent of freshly cut grass. Nora Whitaker, 68, had just dropped the last handful of soil onto the oak coffin of my husband Harold, my companion of 43 years. People stood around with bowed heads as the pastor recited the final prayer. I might collapse in that very moment when the phone in my pocket buzzed. A message lit up on the screen. "I'm still alive. Don't let them bury me again." My heart pounded wildly. My fingers shook so hard I nearly dropped the phone into the wet dirt. Who would play such a cruel joke during a funeral? The coffin had just been covered, but those words cut through my chest like a knife. Before I could regain my composure, another text arrived. "Don't trust Ethan and Cole." I looked up. My two sons, Ethan and Cole, were holding each other sobbing, but their eyes were dry, not an absolute tear in sight. A chill ran through me. A strong gust of wind whipped my black morning dress tight around my legs, as if to warn me the real storm was still ahead. The funeral ended hastily. Fewer than 10 people came to see him off, a few familiar neighbors, some of Harold's old co-workers, and, of course, Sloane, Ethan's wife. She tottered over the wet grass on thin stilettos, as if they might snap entirely made up, wearing a half-pitying, half-disdainful smile. I noticed her lean in to whisper something to Cole, and the two of them glanced at me, as if sharing a secret. On the drive home, I didn't say a word. The thuds of soil hitting the coffin still echoed in my ears, mingled with the vibration of my phone. I locked everything inside, my fear, my suspicion. I knew in this game composure was the only armor I had. That evening, I sat alone in the living room, the ticking clock blending with the faint pine scent rising from the old wooden floor. I opened my phone. The sender's number was unfamiliar, and no name or location was saved. I tried texting, "Who is this?" back, but the screen stayed silent. I was about to put it away when another message flashed. "They changed the paperwork. Check the joint account." My legs went weak. It felt like I'd fallen into a pit and changed the paperwork. What did that mean? I staggered up and opened the drawer where Harold and I kept a metal box with all our essential documents: life insurance, house deed, the woodshop license. Everything seemed intact until my eyes stopped on Harold's life insurance policy. The figure that used to be $5,000 had become $50,000, changed 6 months ago. Harold had hated debt and red tape all his life and had never told me about this. I racked my memory. 6 months ago, Ethan started dropping by more often, hinting at Mom and Dad's plans. On the morning Harold died, it was Ethan who called to say there'd been an accident at the shop. I rushed to the hospital, only to find both my sons already waiting in the ICU hallway, unnervingly calm, insurance papers already in hand. While I sobbed at the bedside, they whispered to the doctor about treatment costs and the payout. That image returned now, the pieces twisting with those cryptic messages, making my heart tremble. Did Harold really die in an accident? Or was there a terrible secret buried beneath that fresh mound of earth? I pressed my face into Harold's old coat, still hanging on the chair, breathing in the remaining scent of sweat and pine. Tears spilled, soaking the fabric. In the dark, I whispered, "Harold, if someone hurt you, I swear I won't let them bury the truth." The phone buzzed again. A short message: "Be careful. They'll do to you what they did to him." I shivered and stared around the dark house. Tree shadows twisted across the window like reaching arms. From that moment, I knew the quiet life of a widow was over. A new battle had begun. If this story touches your heart, please comment, share your thoughts, and hit like and follow so we can continue uncovering family secrets where sacrifice, betrayal, and self-liberation are laid bare. The next morning, I used a shopping errand as an excuse to avoid sitting at breakfast with Ethan and Cole. Instead of turning toward the usual supermarket, I drove straight to the bank where Harold and I had kept our joint account for 30 years. The manager, Mr. Randall, an old friend of Harold's, looked at me and slowly shook his head in condolence. I forced a smile, though my insides were burning. "Randall," I said, "I need the last 3 months of statements for our joint account." He hesitated. His eyes seemed to avoid mine, as if he were afraid of causing me more pain. Finally, he handed me a stack of papers and lowered his voice. "You should brace yourself." My hands trembled so badly the pages rustled nonstop. I sat in a wooden chair by the window and flipped through them. My heart cramped at the numbers in January, a $1,000 withdrawal. In February, $3,000. In March, $4,000. Regular step by step, as if a familiar hand had been squeezing the family's lifeblood dry. Worse were the signatures under each slip. Harold Whitaker. It was his name, but the pen strokes were shaky, scrawled nothing like the steady hand he'd had for 40 years. I stared until my eyes blurred. Ethan's voice echoed, "Dad forgot his glasses, let me read it." And Randall suddenly remembered I saw Ethan with him twice, said he was helping with the small print. I left the bank feeling torn in two. Part of me wanted to believe Harold had truly grown frail and needed his son's help. The other part screamed that Harold had never let anyone sign for him. Those wobbly lines looked like the trace of a forced hand. By late afternoon, the sky over Cedar Falls was heavy and gray. When I got home, Ethan and Sloane were already on the sofa with a glossy brochure lying on the coffee table for a luxury senior facility. Sloane smiled brightly, pointing at shiny photos, a pool, a gym, doctors on call 24/7. "You'll be much happier there. This old wooden house isn't right for old age." My heart thudded, but I kept a frail face. I only nodded, "I'll think about it." In truth, I had sworn inside Harold, and I had built this house together, each plank soaked with sweat, each brick with blood from our hands. No one had the right to take it from me. That night I couldn't sleep. Statements lay spread across the table, and the fake, shaky signatures seemed to mock me. I opened my phone. Another message appeared. "They changed the paperwork. Keep looking." The night felt endless. I sat there listening to the clock's beat, fear and fury tangled in my chest. In that moment, I realized if I stayed still, the day would come when I too would be erased, buried beneath a pile of papers they forged. The next morning, I called Leah, my friend from high school. I didn't tell her everything, only that I needed a ride to the wood shop. I had to see the place with my own eyes. The road to the outskirts was quiet, tall pines on both sides whispering in the wind. When we stopped before the locked shop door, my heart clenched. The smell of wood still lingered, but it felt cold, like a severed piece of my life. I laid my hand on the rusty lock, remembering the mornings Harold turned on the radio as the scent of sawdust floated in the sun. How could a cautious man like him have a machine explosion? On the way back, Leah looked at me in the rearview mirror, worried. "Nora, are you sure you want to dig into this? If Ethan and Cole are really involved?" I clenched my fists, my voice hoarse. Harold deserves the truth. If they really hurt him, I won't let it stand. That night I sat in the living room with Harold's coat still hanging on the chair. I pressed my face to it and let my tears soak the fabric. The phone buzzed again. Just one line. "Careful. They'll do to you what they did to him." I lifted my head and stared at the darkness filling the house. For the first time in my life, the place that had been our nest felt like a battlefield, and I knew there was no turning back. That night I tossed and turned, unable to sleep. My mind circled the words from the text, "Ask about ethylene glycol at the shop." I knew little about chemicals, but the name sounded as sharp as a blade. Fear rose in me, but suspicion rose higher. Near midnight, I threw on a cardigan, grabbed a flashlight, and drove quietly to Harold's woodshop. The old metal door was ajar, its lock corroded. I pushed it. The hinges squealed. Inside it was pitch dark. The familiar smell of wood lingered, laced with something harsh and cloyingly sweet that choked me. I swept the flashlight over the shelves. In the top corner sat a half-empty plastic bottle. I reached up. The worn label read, "Antifreeze. Ethylene glycol." A stab of pain shot through me. Harold has worked with wood his whole life. He has never used automotive chemicals. I opened the cap, and a sweet, acrid odor hit me, sending me into a coughing fit. In the dim light, I saw cloudy smudges like fingerprints on the bottleneck. My hands trembled. I pictured Harold, the man so careful he checked each nail 3 times, being forced to swallow this poison. My whole body went cold, as if an invisible hand squeezed my throat. I dropped onto the long wooden bench where Harold used to rest. Memories flooded in. He sat here wiping sweat and smiling as I brought lunch during those noon hours. Now the place felt like a witness to a dark plot. Tears soaked my collar, but I bit my lip to keep from crying out loud. The next morning I took the chemical bottle to the Cedar Falls police station. Sergeant Miguel Alvarez, an old acquaintance of Harold's, met me in a small room, concern clouding his eyes as I set the bottle down. I told him everything: the texts, the bank records, the forged signatures, and the sweet deadly smell in the shop. Alvarez silently pulled up the hospital records on his computer. After a few minutes he looked up, his voice heavy. "Mrs. Whitaker, there's no report of any plane explosion at the shop. In fact, the medical notes from Mr. Harold's admissions say suspected ethylene glycol poisoning, deep coma." "But—" He paused, meeting my eyes. "The family signed to keep that confidential, citing the wife is too fragile to handle the truth." I went numb. My fingers dug into the chair so hard my nails turned white. The family, which meant Ethan and Cole, they had signed it. They had staged a machine explosion to hide the truth. I stood and left the station like a ghost. Outside, the noon sun was scorching, but my world had frozen. I remembered their dry eyes at the funeral, the bank statements, Sloan's neat placement of a senior facility brochure, like a ready verdict. The pieces now formed a horrific picture. My husband hadn't been taken by fate, but by the very sons I had borne. Late afternoon, as I reached home, my phone buzzed again. A text from an unknown number. "Don't let them fool you. Check Harold's desk drawer. He left something for you." I shook all over. I had opened that drawer dozens of times after Harold died and found only old papers. Was there something I'd missed, or had Harold managed to send a desperate signal in his final days? That evening I sat alone in the study. The familiar room felt suddenly heavy. The dark wooden desk still carried the faint smell of the cigarettes he used to smoke. I pulled the drawer open. Papers were in disarray, but at the very bottom, tucked among crumpled sheets, was a small notebook in Harold's shaky hand. I turned to the last page. The scrawled lines froze my blood. "Ethan says to increase the insurance so Mom feels secure. Cole brought papers and says they're going to upgrade the shop, but I'm uneasy. Something is wrong." I closed the notebook, my whole body trembling. Part of Harold's soul had tried to warn me, and I, his wife of a lifetime, had failed to see it. Tears splattered the worn cover. I vowed in the room's stillness, "Harold, you left a trail. I won't let them erase it. I'll follow it to the end." I sat for hours with Harold's small notebook, each shaky line carved into my heart like a blade. But the strange message still haunted me. "Recheck the drawer. Harold left it for you." As the clock struck midnight that night, I opened the dark wooden desk again. I took out every old paper, searched each compartment, and ran my fingers along the edges of the wood. Suddenly my fingertip caught on a narrow seam, as if a piece of wood had been set separately. I pressed lightly. Click, a panel popped out, revealing a hidden cavity. Inside lay a worn brown envelope. On the front, in Harold's familiar hand, shaky but determined, were the words, "For Nora if I'm gone." My heart hammered painfully as I lifted it out. Inside were a small black USB drive and a note bearing Harold's signature, "Daniel Pierce, private investigator. Trust him." I had never heard the name, but I knew Harold must have turned to someone outside the family, perhaps when he began to suspect our own sons. With trembling hands, I plugged the USB into Harold's old laptop. There was only one file, proofed at MP3. I drew a deep breath and pressed play. The first voice was Harold's hoarse, urgent, "Daniel, if you're hearing this, I'm in danger. Ethan and Cole are pressuring me to sign new insurance forms. They claim it's for Nora, but I don't believe them. If anything happens to me, please keep the evidence." I clapped a hand over my mouth as tears poured down. His voice was so familiar, each word shredded my heart. Then the next voices froze my blood. Ethan's voice I recognized, the cold cadence instantly. "We need to move fast. The older man's getting suspicious. Methanol will make it look like a stroke. No one will trace it." Then Cole's voice, lower, trembling. What about Mom? What if she finds out? Ethan let out a dry laugh. She's old. If we have to, we'll mark her as bereavement-induced paranoia. Send her to a nursing home. Who's going to believe a dotty older woman? I sat petrified. My body went icy. The laptop nearly slipped from my hands. Those weren't imaginings or suspicions. It was the naked truth, my two sons plotting their father's death, and I was next. I stopped the file. The living room fell deathly quiet. Only my heartbeat pounded in my ears. How had the children I raised with love and care become men who could destroy their own blood for money? I thought back to the old days. Ethan is holding my hand, running through the backyard in worn-out shoes. Cole sat for hours on the porch waiting for Harold to carve him a little wooden car. How had those boys become strangers? Outside, the wind howled and the windows rattled. I put the USB and envelope into my coat pocket and sat stunned until dawn. Pale light slid into the room like a stabbing pain. I knew I could no longer hold these secrets alone. I dialed the number on the card Harold had left. The phone rang 3 times, then a deep, steady voice answered. "This is Daniel Pierce." I choked up. "Mr. Pierce, I'm Nora, Harold's wife. I found the USB. I've heard everything." There was a brief silence, then his tone softened. "Mrs. Whitaker, you finally know. Harold asked me to watch Ethan and Cole. I have more evidence than what's on that drive. We need to meet." I wiped my tears and drew a breath. "We're Riverside Diner, tomorrow at 3. I'll bring everything Harold left." I nodded, though he couldn't see. When I set the phone down, a small spark of hope flickered. Perhaps justice still existed. But tangled with it was a greater fear than ever. If Ethan and Cole learned I had the evidence, they wouldn't hesitate to clean up. I latched the windows, bolted the front door, and sat beneath our old wedding photo on the wall. In it, Harold held my hand, his eyes peaceful. I whispered, "Don't worry. I'll keep my promise. I won't let the truth be buried." Outside, the wind kept roaring. I knew I had stepped into a fight inside the wooden house with no way back. The next afternoon, I put on the lavender dress Harold once said was gentle but firm. I carefully slipped the USB, the notebook, and the note with Daniel Pierce's name into my handbag and headed out. The road to Riverside Diner ran between rows of late spring maples, tender leaves rustling in the breeze. My chest held a tangle of feelings, fear, anger, and a fragile thread of hope. The small diner sat at the corner of Main with faded red brick and a weathered sign. When I stepped inside, the doorbell chimed. The smell of roasted coffee and fresh apple pie pulled me back to simple mornings with Harold when he always had a strong black cup before the shop. In the far corner, a man stood. He looked a little over 50, tall and lean, with close-cropped salt-and-pepper hair and a worn brown coat. His eyes were deep and sharp, but not cold. He offered his hand. "Mrs. Whitaker, I'm Daniel Pierce. I'm sorry, but we're meeting under these circumstances." I sat still, gripping my bag strap. Daniel slid a thick file toward me with several color photos on top. The moment I turned them over, my chest seized. The first photo, Ethan exiting a hardware store holding a bottle of methanol. The second, Cole in a dim bar handing a wad of cash to a stranger. The last is Ethan and Cole beside a luxury car, faces tense as if in a heated argument. Daniel spoke slowly in a gravelly voice, as if too familiar with harsh truths. Harold hired me 3 weeks before he died. He suspected the boys were hiding something. I planted recording devices and tracked their trips to the bank and the shop. The USB you found is only part of it. Here's the rest. He turned on an old recorder. The audio was crystal clear. Ethan's voice. "Tomorrow, small dose first, he'll start fading. Mom will think it's old age." Cole's voice hesitant. "What if she notices Ethan's sneer already handled? Dr. Albertson will certify she's mentally unstable. Then the nursing home." Each line hit like a hammer. I sat frozen, tears streaming. Daniel rested a hand on the file, eyes steady. "You see, this isn't a suspicion anymore. Their motive is plain. Ethan's over $70,000 in debt from failed real estate bets. Cole lost $40,000 gambling. If they don't pay, the collectors will come. You and Harold were their only lifeline." I crushed the tissue in my fist, devastated and enraged. I remembered the times Harold worried the way he looked at me on the porch. "I'm afraid we lost our boys long ago." He was right. The children I once held had become ruthless traitors. Daniel went on firm. "We have enough photos, recordings, debt records, Harold's notes. But to expose them, you must steel yourself. This isn't just a case, it's a family war. You'll have to face your sons in court." I trembled. I don't know if I can." At the funeral, seeing them, I felt half dead already. To stand before them and call them criminals. Daniel met my eyes, his voice low but warm. "Harold died, leaving the truth. If you stay silent, he dies a second time. If you speak, he's vindicated. And you save yourself." I closed my eyes and breathed in. Harold's image rose, sitting on the shop bench, eyes gentle as he watched me sew by the window. He'd spent his life protecting me and this home. Now it was my turn to protect him, even in the grave. When I opened my eyes, my hands had stopped shaking. I nodded. "I'll do it. For Harold. For the truth." Daniel gave a slight satisfied nod and gathered the file. "I'll contact Sergeant Alvarez tonight. We'll take the first step. But be careful. Ethan and Cole aren't stupid. If they sense you know, they'll move fast." On the drive home, the evening light draped our wooden house in a pale gold like a mourning cloth over all of Cedar Falls. I held the bag containing the evidence and knew that from this moment on, my life had turned down a different road, a thorny one, but the only path that could pull Harold out of the dark. Cedar Falls lay under a thin morning mist. I wrapped an old shawl around my shoulders and sat on the porch bench, both hands clasping a teacup gone cold. I hadn't slept. I just replayed my meeting with Daniel, the photos and the recordings. Harold's request drilled into my heart. "Find out if anything seems off." At noon, Daniel called, his voice low and crisp. "Mrs. Whitaker, I've spoken with Sergeant Alvarez. The prosecutor signed the exhumation order. Tomorrow they'll open Harold's grave for forensic testing." I went silent. Only a week earlier, I'd dropped handfuls of soil on his coffin. Now I would watch them dig him up. The thought broke my heart, but I knew it was the only way to lay the truth bare. The next morning, I went to the cemetery with Daniel. A strong wind blew under a gloomy sky, echoing my grief. Police cars and the medical examiner's van were already there. They raised a white tarp around the site. Alvarez approached and laid a heavy hand on my shoulder. "Do you want to witness this? It will be hard, but Harold may need you here." I swallowed and nodded. "I have to be." Shovels bit into the earth, each scoop sounding like a blow to my chest. I stood outside the tarp, tears falling unchecked. When the wooden coffin emerged, my throat seized. The forensic team opened it. I turned my head away but heard the scratching of pens and the clinking of metal instruments. A short while later, the techs brought out vials of residual blood and took samples from the liver and kidneys. "Enough for toxicology," they said briefly. Alvarez's eyes were firm. "Trust that this will come to light." I nodded, my legs barely holding me. Daniel gently guided me to the car. We drove in silence, the tires whispering over rain-wet asphalt. It felt like the world was testing me, losing my husband, then watching them cut into what remained of him for proof. But I knew Harold would want me to be strong. We were called to the medical examiner's office in Louisville a few days later. The room was cold fluorescent lights glaring off thick files. The gray-haired examiner, face grave, opened a folder. The results show extremely high levels of ethylene glycol in Mr. Harold's blood and tissues. This caused renal failure, neurological damage, and death. The words fell like a stone. I closed my eyes, picturing Harold inert tubes everywhere. Now I understand it wasn't an accident, nor old age. He had been poisoned. The examiner turned another page. Notably, the original death report was altered. Signs of poisoning were removed. Daniel gripped the papers, anger in his voice. This was deliberate concealment. "We have evidence of who paid the doctor to falsify the report." I turned to the wall, clutching my chest as sobs broke free. Alvarez slid a tissue toward me, his tone steady but resolute. "Mrs. Whitaker, we now have photos, recordings, financials, and forensics. Your sons won't be able to deny this." I looked up through a blur of tears. "What's the next step?" "We'll obtain arrest warrants for Ethan and Cole for first-degree murder and complicity," Alvarez said. "But be ready. They may retaliate, even try to discredit you by any means. This will be a long fight." On the way home, the clouds finally parted. Sunlight poured through the windshield onto my hands, gripping Harold's notebook. I felt he was beside me, lending me the strength he had left. I whispered, "Do you see Harold?" I didn't give up. The truth is surfacing, like you being lifted from the earth to speak one last time. The car rolled on, leaving the quiet cemetery behind. Inside me, a fire kindled one nothing could put out until justice was done. The toxicology findings hadn't even gone public before the police moved. One overcast morning, the phone rang while I was staring at the empty garden through my window. Sergeant Alvarez's voice was soft but decisive. "Mrs. Whitaker, the warrants are signed. We're hitting Ethan's apartment today. If you want, you can observe from a distance." I gripped the armrest. Half of me longed to see the traitor brought low. The other half shook, remembering the infant son I once cradled through the night. In the end, I said, "I'll come." Ethan's apartment was in downtown Louisville, a gleaming glass building far from our rustic little town. As the cruisers stopped at the entrance, I spotted his sleek black car at the curb, flaunting itself in broad daylight. Officers in body armor moved in. Daniel and I stood across the street. In moments, the door was breached and a shout echoed down the hall. "Police, don't move." Minutes later, they brought Ethan out. His face was pale, but his eyes still burned with arrogance. He turned and saw me. A thin, mocking smile flickered. "You're here too, Mom," he rasped, taunting. I stood silent. Almost simultaneously, another team grabbed Cole as he left the parking lot of an underground casino. He didn't resist. He only hung his head, stunned and hollow. My gentler son looked soulless. The most significant shock wasn't my sons, but the figure behind them. Sloane, Ethan's wife, arrived at the station with a lawyer, her face equally frosty. Alvarez came out to brief me. "We pulled a plan off her personal computer to sell your house after having you committed to a nursing home. There are emails to a real estate firm and survey images of your land. She's an accomplice." I went rigid. Sloane's words at the funeral replayed, "You should move to a care facility, it'd be more comfortable." Every move had been scripted. In the interrogation room, I sat behind the glass and watched Ethan fold his arms with feigned nonchalance. His lawyer invoked the possibility of edited audio. But when Alvarez played the exact conversation I'd heard on the USB, I saw Ethan falter. He turned his face away, fear flaring for an instant before he masked it. Cole was different. His eyes filled when the photo of him handing off cash in the bar was shown. "I didn't want to. I just followed Ethan. I was deep in debt. I couldn't get out," he muttered through tears. But truth doesn't care about who led and who followed. My heart tore, but reason knew both had gone too far. Sloane remained defiant. She claimed she only advised me to seek better care. But the real estate emails stamped with her digital signature told the tale. I looked at the woman and felt a surge of unnameable rage. She hadn't just aided them, but fed the betrayal, turning my blood family into a commodity. When night fell, I returned to our wooden house in Cedar Falls. The sky glittered with stars, but there was no peace in me. I stood before Harold's photo and murmured, "Do you see love, Ethan, Cole, and Sloane, all unmasked? Justice is close, but I never imagined my heart could hurt this much." Outside, the wind sighed through the trees, a warning that the road was still long. Arrests were only the beginning. I knew the real battle would be fought in court, where I would have to face the children I had raised with all my love. On the morning of the trial, Cedar Falls wore a solid gray. I climbed the stone steps of the county courthouse, gripping my bag with Harold's notebook and copies of the evidence. Each step pressed down on my chest. I was no longer just a lonely widow. Today I would stand as a witness agonizingly against my own blood. The courtroom was packed. Townspeople crowded in, some curious, some compassionate. I heard the whispers. Their own sons killed their father, then planned to push the mother into a home. The murmurs pricked like needles but steeled me. Ethan sat ramrod straight on the defense bench in a black suit, eyes like ice. Beside him, Cole kept his head down, gaunt hair uncombed. I glanced once and looked away. My heart lurched too hard to bear. The prosecutor, young but iron-voiced, rose. "Your Honor, today, we are not only trying a criminal case, but witnessing the ultimate betrayal within a family. The evidence shows Ethan and Cole Whitaker poisoned their father with ethylene glycol to seize insurance money and assets. They also planned to commit their own mother to a nursing home by fabricating psychiatric records to silence her. This is cruelty beyond any moral boundary." The defense attorney sprang up, confident. "Your Honor, the recordings introduced by the state could easily be altered. Mr. Harold died of age-related complications. There is no direct proof that my clients committed murder. This is the emotional conjecture of a grieving wife." The room rustled. I felt my blood rise but kept calm. Piece by piece, the prosecutor laid out toxicology, confirming lethal ethylene glycol levels. Photos of Ethan leaving a store with methanol, Cole passing cash in a bar, bank statements with forged signatures, debt reports. Each item hammered the flimsy shield of the defense. When my name was called, my feet felt rooted. Daniel touched my shoulder and whispered, "You're Harold's last voice." I drew a long breath and took the stand. The prosecutor said, "Mrs. Nora Whitaker, please tell the jury what you discovered." I stared straight ahead, my voice shaky at first, then firmer. "I found Harold's notebook where he wrote that Ethan and Cole pressured him to sign insurance papers. I received strange texts that led me to the joint account and its unusual withdrawals. I found a chemical bottle at the shop, something Harold never used. And most importantly, the USB Harold left recorded my sons' voices plotting to poison their father and forge psychiatric records for me." The room fell silent. The prosecutor played the recording. Ethan's voice rang out, "Tomorrow, a small dose. Mom will think it's old age." Cole's followed. "What if she finds out?" Then Ethan's flat chuckle. "Who'll believe a paranoid older woman?" A hush swept the courtroom. Hands flew to mouths. The defense pounced. "Mrs. Whitaker, you just lost your husband. Are you sure you weren't hallucinating? Neighbors say you were talking to yourself after the funeral." I looked him dead in the eye, my voice harder than ever. "I lost my husband, that's a pain beyond words. But my mind is clear. If I imagined it, explain the photos, the forged signatures, the toxin in Harold's blood, and those cold words. I didn't imagine my son's voices." A heavy hush followed. Ethan met my gaze for the first time, rage flickering beneath the ice. Cole's shoulders shook, his head bowed. I knew this was the line between truth and lies, motherhood and justice. When I stepped down, my legs were weak, but my heart roared. I had kept my promise to Harold. I would not be silent. The rest lay with the jury, those who would decide the fate of the sons I had spent a lifetime loving, and now had to deliver to justice. During the recess, as the jury deliberated, I drifted through my days in a daze. Each morning, sunlight poured through the window and felt unreal. In our old home, I passed the wooden chair where Harold read the paper, the kitchen where we fought and made up. Every pass sent a sharp ache through me. In the silence, a question echoed, "If you were alive, Harold, would you forgive our sons?" On verdict day, the courthouse was more crowded than ever. The townsfolk squeezed in to witness the end. On the bench, Ethan sat, rigid lips pressed, thin weariness flickering in his eyes. Cole had grown gaunt hair, disheveled hands laced and trembling. I sat in the front row behind the prosecutor. The two men before me were no longer the boys I had cradled, but men about to receive the heaviest sentences of their lives. The judge's gavel fell. The room went still. The foreperson entered, paper trembling in hand, and read, "As to Ethan Whitaker, we find the defendant guilty of first-degree murder." A ripple of shock filled the room. I heard someone gasp behind me. Ethan lifted his face. His eyes were empty. The foreperson continued, "As to Cole Whitaker, we find the defendant guilty of complicity and conspiracy to commit murder." Cole burst into tears at once. His sobs echoed in the heavy room. I clutched my chest as if stabbed again. The judge struck the gavel and pronounced sentence, Ethan Whitaker, life imprisonment without parole. Cole Whitaker, 30 years in prison. No one spoke. Only the rustle of papers, the scratch of pens, and the muffled weeping of familiar townspeople remained. I sat motionless, tears rolling down my cheeks. This was justice, but it carved itself into my heart as a second sentence. As officers led them away, I sprang up involuntarily. Ethan looked back at me,